Perhaps I'll just kick off while we're organising the technology here. Welcome to the Daiwa Foundation. This year our main seminar series is themed on power. And so today we're going to be talking about the power of information and knowledge. And I can see it could be quite a wide-ranging discussion. Is Professor Arthur Stockman, who I think needs very little introduction because he's been a friend of the Foundation for many years. And is known to pretty well everybody in this country who has something to do with Japan. So I'll introduce him very briefly. He is Emeritus Fellow of St Anthony's College, Oxford, and the Nissan Institute of Japanese Studies, where he was the founding director. And he has many publications, but I think it's fair to say that his specialism is in politics, particularly Japanese politics. And he's also general editor of the Nissan Institute Routledge Japanese Studies. Joint. And is the proud possessor of the Order of the Rising Sun from the Japanese government in recognition of the work that he's done to promote Japanese studies in the UK. So
Well, thank you, Joseph, for that very kind introduction, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We have a very broad-ranging discussion ahead of us tonight on the power of information and knowledge, and we have two distinguished speakers. I will introduce them before each of them speaks, but first of all let me say just one or two words about the subject of tonight's seminar. This is of course a general issue, the power of information and knowledge, but in relation to both of our countries, this country and Japan, it is a very, very current and relevant set of issues that are raised by this topic. In relation to Japan, there is one particularly contentious issue that has surfaced in the recent period, which is that in December of last year, at the end of last year, the Japanese National Diet, the Parliament, passed a bill which is called the Designated Secrets Bill, law, which has become extremely controversial, not only in Japan but outside Japan at all as well, and it is being noticed as potentially raising some very difficult issues about the question of freedom of speech and control of information and things of this kind. There have also been there is also some controversy about recent appointments to senior positions in NHK, the national broadcaster, which is the rough equivalent of the BBC. And so it's a very current issue in Japan, but also in this country. We've had the hacking scandal here and things of this kind. So the first, we're going to go in reverse order of what is on your handout. The first speaker is going to be Mr. Umehara Toshiya, who is London Bureau Chief and European Editor of the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's most important and prestigious and intelligent newspapers. Mr. Umehara holds a BA in Politics from ICU, the International Christian University in Tokyo. He joined the Asahi Shimbun in 1988 and has been engaged in international news reporting since the 1990s. He's been to various places, Brussels, Vienna, Washington DC. He's conducted interviews with many foreign officials such as Colin Powell and William Hague. He's covered many conflicts including the Kosovo conflict, the Iraq issue, directly from the conflict zones themselves. And early in 2011 he led a team of writers who broke stories on US diplomatic cables on Japan in cooperation with WikiLeaks. And from September 2011 to April 2012 he was a national news desk editor in Tokyo, overseeing stories on disaster prevention and the aftermath of the Fukushima meltdown disaster. And during that period he also edited the renowned series Nuclear Power and the Media. Mr. Umehara.
Sorry. So thank you for the introduction. until 5 minutes before this start, I thought I would be the second to talk, and I was thinking about the beginning of this presentation about being about the disadvantage of being the second and looking amateurish after a great scholar. But well, I just found out that even I'm the first, I look very amateurish, and I'm not a great theorist. So please excuse my well. Also, I'm using a foreign language, so please excuse if anything is a little bit unclear. But let me note that the comments and opinion that I would express here does not represent the newspaper that I work for. And so today, I'd like to talk about, well, this is the power of information, but I'd like to talk about rather a powerless status of Japanese media. And I'd like to talk about the role of media, both traditional established media and also social media in Japan. Okay, let me start about showing these two pictures. Two pictures of snow. They're taken in the different places on Earth. One is taken in Japan last week. Last week, eastern part of Japan was hit by a very heavy snowfall of historical magnitude, and cars were stuck and communities were isolated, and then it was a huge disaster. But all the while, in Sochi, Russia, there's, as you already know, the Winter Olympic Games is going on, and the fans of winter sports, including myself, are very much attracted to what's going on, especially with our compatriot is doing. And now, if you do engage in Twitter, for example, in Japan, you might have noticed that there is a sort of a pattern of criticism against media. Under this situation, it goes something like the established media do not cover the snowfall disaster at all, and instead they're devoting resources to Olympic. And also the great number of individuals tweet and post on the Facebook about their individual distressed situation and appeal the local authority or national government to alleviate the isolation of communities. And was it a valid criticism? I think there's a fair point, but actually we do cover the snowfall also, and actually rather heavily. And it's kind of a myth that the established media is only interested in the Olympics. And the same pattern of criticism was seen through the nuclear accident in Fukushima. And the media was and is still being accused of suppressing and withholding information as to the magnitude of seriousness of the disaster, and deliberately making it look smaller, being afraid of making a panic. For example, the media is accused of not using the word meltdown of the core reactor. I have no intention to trivialize the seriousness of the situation. The fact the communities of more than 100,000 people were destroyed in itself was extraordinary. But there also exists a little bit overblown concern about the effect of radiation, especially outside of the exclusion zone. despite the scientific data that health hazard so far by the accident were relatively low on a limited scale, and no direct death has occurred so far by the radiation itself. Some doubt that premise. They even suspect a sort of a conspiracy between media and the operator of the power plant, TEPCO, and the nuclear industry. And here exists a complete distrust towards news coverage by the media. Is it accurate? Let's do some fact-checking of how established media, including Asahi Shimbun, did report on this. The picture here is evening edition of Asahi on the 15th of March 2011. But it's 4 days later, 4 days after the earthquake. The main headline here says, Fukushima Daiichi hard to control. And the sub one is saying, fear of mass scattering of radiation. And here there's also sort of an advisory for the people saying, prepare for the worst situation. So here you will find nothing to minimize the impact of disaster. And also the fact that there was a high possibility of a meltdown going on was already reported by us on 13th of March, which is 2 days even before this. So I would argue the media at that time was actually not so doing badly. And so why such a distrust towards the media coverage and the myth of withholding information? One possible contributing factor was that there was a gap between what the outside authority, including the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States government, and what was worrying, and the real situation. Here you're looking at the spent fuel storage pool of Unit 4 of Fukushima. This is the center of focus, and the U.S. government was worrying that there weren't enough water to protect the spent fuel, and if that's the situation, we would have talking about the evacuation by the scale of 100 times larger. But actually there were enough water, and it happened just by the sheer lack. There was a building next to it, the reactor building, and there's also a water. And by a shoddy installation work, just several days before the earthquake, this water comes into the pool. So if that didn't happen, yeah, of course we would have to face a very serious disaster. So I do understand the U.S. government's logic due to, for example, setting 80 kilometer or 50 miles radius exclusion zone, which is far larger than the Japanese government one. But this gap does not necessarily mean that the Japanese government is withholding information. But by some people, this leads to a suspicion and then even a conviction that Japanese media was not telling the information. I'm not saying that there was nothing wrong about the news media coverage on nuclear power in general in Japan. On the contrary, I think media is at least partially guilty of being a tacit accomplice information in forming of a myth of absolute safety of nuclear power. For example, I personally feel regret about an incident happened in 1999 in Tokaimura. It was a criticality accident in a uranium reprocessing facility, and it resulted in 2 deaths. I was at the time based in Vienna and covering IAEA as part of my responsibility. And the explanation given by the Japanese authority was that this is, well, the incident was very unfortunate, but it's nothing, it's done by a very exceptionally careless practice made by the operators. And this does not represent the safety standard of Japanese nuclear industry. I basically took the explanation on the at face value. But after Fukushima, I think I should have raised enough more question about the safety culture of Japanese nuclear industry. And the same things happened over the last 6 decades, basically, after the World War II. And in the series, Nuclear Power and Media, we do discuss, how media ourselves, including, Asahi, why we couldn't do enough to prevent the disaster. Anyway, so now we understand there's a huge distrust towards established media in general. And there's a Japanese word expression, masu-gomi. It's a playing on words with masu-komi, which means mass communication, and gomi, rubbish. So it's, mass communication is full of rubbish. And, some criticism, I think, it's duly warranted. For example, when you look at the issue of Kisha Club, press club, which is criticized as a sort of a cartel type of exclusive group making sort of a de facto oligopoly of information. But as I just explained about Fukushima disaster, some accusations are made without actually looking at the fact or without looking at how media is reporting. For me, as somebody who is working for a newspaper, it's a very sad situation, but more than that, it also reflects the waning influence of established media in Japan. So, is this healthy for a society? I would argue, no, it's not healthy. If you look at the situation of this Japanese politics and then the passing of the bill just mentioned just at the beginning, it was hastily enacted through parliament, despite a wide range of population expressing doubt or opposing views. I, for one, personally, do recognize the need for such legislation, but however, I point three areas of concern. One is vague definition of secrecy, what secret means, and another is very long period of classification. It could be classified over, in an extreme case, it could be classified over 60 years. And also, finally, the bad point about this bill is there aren't enough safeguard for the protection of freedom press and news reporting and protection of whistleblower. These are my concerns, but more than that, more alarming I found would be lack of dialogue through the passing of this legislation, and there aren't many discussions at all. So, protection of freedom of speech and whistleblower should be universal, I believe. Last week, I interviewed this guy, Alan Richard, editor-in-chief of Guardian newspaper. This was the PC which contained the Snowden files and then ordered by the British authority to destruct. I think it was rather poor publicity by the British authority, because one cannot help thinking of making analogy with this as burning books and suppression of knowledge. Anyway, Mr. Rusbridger told me that about the special designated secret act of Japan this way. We need to remind individual states that there should be a universal standards of free speech and protection for whistleblowers and journalists. He was pointing out that if you welcome a whistleblower from, for example, from China, and all the while suppressing, whistleblower in your country, that's not going to work. So for the protection of whistleblower, some would argue that we don't need an established media. We can do that on the internet by putting everything on the internet. So I would name them as sort of a transparency fundamentalists. They demand everything need to be totally on the internet and become public. I have an interesting and personal experience of dealing with them about the diplomatic cable. And I remember immediately after we broke the story, some reaction on the internet that Asahi do not need to do this. They should just put the whole thing, they shouldn't edit. Well, actually, WikiLeaks did that eventually, but actually that wouldn't cause any stir at all. So I would argue that's why we need a journalist doing their job, exercising editorial judgments. So I have like 3 minutes, right? When you look at the social media, you should look at the situation in Japan and Japanese politics and society. You should take a look at the Prime Minister Abe's Facebook page, especially the comments section. It's full of jingoistic comments and luring out whatsoever the outside interference and doubting media's sincerity, saying something like the Asahi Shimbun is the agent of Chinese government, etc. But here, I found more alarming is also, again, actually those do oppose also wrote some comments, but there is no dialogue between them. And let me go back to the beginning, the cover of this slides. This is the commuter train in Japan. And it tells many things. First of all, obviously, everybody is busy with their smartphones, and nobody is talking to each other, and nobody is reading newspaper. It's a society with a highly developed information technology, but this also looks like a sort of a compartmentalized society. So finally, on social media. I myself was an early adopter. I was the first official account manager or the official Twitter of Asahi Shimbun foreign news section account, which has followers of close to 100,000. And I do find it very great tool to for two-way communication with my readers. And sometimes, Facebook and Twitter, as it happened in the Arab Spring in 2011, it unites people and it encourages transparency. But at the same time, people tend to look at only the flow of information going through in their timeline, and they wouldn't be interested in the outside of what's happening outside of their timeline. And it's like something like, if I use the analogy of maps, it would be everybody's using Google Map on their smartphone, but they forget to look at atlas or maps and do not have an idea of how the whole world looks like. So the lack of dialogue is a little bit alarming, and that's one phenomenon I would like to point out about the situation of social media in Japan. But I hope that we would eventually find out the more mature way of communication through social media as well, and eventually social media and the established media do coexist in a more productive way, and so I believe it doesn't have to be a zero sum. And after all, media is a tool. Whether or not it's useful depends on the people who use it. Thank you very much.
Sorry, can you? Our next speaker is Professor Jeremy Black, who is a historian and Professor of History at the University of Exeter, some miles to the west of here. He is a senior fellow at the Centre for the Study of America and the West at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He is the author of over 90 books. Wow, I did a little calculation, assuming the average is 80,000 words in a book. That should be over 7 million words, but the one book I have seen of his has well over 400 pages, and I think it was a lot more than 80,000 words, so a lot of words. He is an expert especially on 18th century British politics and international relations, and is a major exponent of military, diplomatic and cartographic history. He's been important in helping the British look at their past, as well as in representing British history to foreign audiences. Now, his latest book, just in there, is called The Power of Knowledge, How Information and Technology Made the Modern World. And this focuses on the relationship between information and society, and demonstrates how the understanding and use of information have been the primary factors in the development and character of the modern age. Professor Black.
Thank you. Well, I'm not going to summarise this because I hope people will read it, and also because it's not easy to summarise over 200,000 words to go. I'd like to, as it were, give a historian's reflections on some of the issues we're talking about, and I'm going to, I'm afraid, court unpopularity. I've always preferred to play the devil's advocate and to argue against the norm. And let's start off by disagreeing with the editor of the Guardian. Of course, freedom of speech is not absolute. You and I would not wish to hear or read somebody making racist remarks. You or I wouldn't wish to hear somebody making grossly defamatory remarks. The freedom of speech in Britain is extraordinarily restricted, as is right and proper, by a whole set of constraints. So also with government records. The majority of the government records, in fact, are individual tax records and individual medical records. They are never disclosed. So the idea that there is some absolute, and that the press is the guardian, or historians, my profession, are the guardians of this, and that we welcome unrestricted access to information, that's an absurdity. The reality is that in every society there has always been a debate as to how much information should be revealed, and how appropriately it should be done. And obviously what has happened is, in every case, you've had the rhetorical strategies in which people always stigmatise those that have other views. So governments regularly stigmatise those who wish to have greater access to material as being potentially a cause of instability, and their opponents who wish for more information regularly stigmatise governments for being autocratic. The interesting aspect of this, and it's an ironic aspect, is it reflects the current thing you've always noticed in historical sources. Everybody always believes that they are weak and that the other side is strong. So in other words, you know, everybody always believes that that government is this extraordinarily powerful, manipulative body that is trying to do down everybody else, when in fact, if you look at government archives, you will notice that governments on the whole are frightened, uncertain, don't know what is going on, they're divided, they are short of resources, they feel perpetually anxious, and so on, obviously, for the critics of government. You know, it's very easy for people to think that the critics of government are, as it were, much more powerful, much more resolute, much more certain, whereas they themselves have issues, as my colleague makes clear, issues about the viability of their project, the profitability of their particular newspaper or media. So one has to, I think, you know, I'm going to start off by saying we've got to be mature about this. It's terribly easy when people talk about access to information. You know, the man at the Guardian is completely absurd if he genuinely believes that trying to restrict information is the equivalent to burning of books. And he's using a highly pejorative reference. He's implying that the attempt to pass through a legislative body a restriction on the freedom of the press or the freedom of access to information is the equivalent of behaving like the Third Reich. Now that is really pretty unworthy. It's also actually rather despicable because, you know, the Third Reich genuinely was, like for example the government of North Korea at the present moment, a genuinely autocratic, vicious and unpleasant regime, and to equate that with governments such as Britain or the United States or Japan at the moment as if they were similar is absurd and actually rather immature. It's the sort of thing I would come down hard on one of my students for, so that I suppose the editor of The Guardian is that kind of person. Let's try and give you a historical analogy. The argument that it's always the value of historians to have masses of information freely available. Well, actually, no. Because what happens if masses of information is freely available is governments don't keep the information in the first place. So let me give you an example. If you look in the British archives, you can find that between the late 1720s and the early 1760s, the British had an agent which they codenamed 101. He's identified as a man called François de Bussy. Started off as a French chargé d'affaires, then became the premier commis, that's the equivalent of the Under-Secretary of State in the Northern Division of the French Foreign Office, that's the division dealing with Northern Europe, and he ended his distinguished career as the French ambassador in London, and throughout that period he was providing the British with high-grade intelligence material. On top of that, interestingly enough, if you read the French archives, and if you read the British ones carefully, you can't help wondering whether he was also a double or a triple agent, but we'll leave that to one side. The point is that that kind of material was kept in the 18th century precisely because nobody assumed those archives would ever be looked at. Now, the idea today that if you have, as it were, massive free access to archives, if you can read diplomatic traffic at once, that people are going to keep all this stuff is naive. And again, we've been here before. A man like Mr. Snowden or you know, the chap with WikiLeaks is no different to the kind of figures you would have found in Paris in the early 1790s, or you would have found in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, Petrograd and then Leningrad in the late 19-teens. All that cult, all that material about open government and how supposedly open government would make things better, we've been there before. This is not new. Again, all the issues that were rolled out then in favour of actually open government and then the revelations that it didn't work in practice. The French revolutionary government found that, what a surprise, other people didn't want to tell them things. What a surprise, they themselves started concealing material, because one of the key things about government, particularly in international relations, is prioritisation. You know, prioritisation means confidentiality. If I am a foreign secretary and I am going to write to a ministerial colleague that whilst I am very concerned, let us say, about the situation in the Middle East, ultimately, I think it's more in Britain's strategic interest to be more concerned about some other issue, let us say relations with Western Europe, or let us say relations, you know, concerns about the issues in East Asia. You can't actually put that document down, because the very fact is that if you express that and it's going to be read, this idea of prioritisation will always offend or upset somebody or other. So there are inherent reasons in the governmental process why one requires a degree of confidentiality. And there are inherent reasons in domestic government in which you require a degree of confidentiality. Now clearly, there are issues in which in a democratic society, because we believe quite rightly that we wish government to be accountable, at the same time we need to actually therefore have ways to gauge some of this information. Now, both the Japanese and the British have been experimenting, if you look at intelligence traffic, with the idea of using senior politicians of both political parties, crucially members of the opposition as well, in select committees to actually see material in camera, as it were, in other words, secretly. That seems to be the way forward at the moment. Obviously, that's a way that's not satisfactory to journalists. One can understand why, because they need and want the scoop. But as I've said, that has to be at some stage a degree of balance here, because if you go for the scoop for everything, people will not reveal material. I can tell you in just the very minor world I'm in, the terribly minor world of universities, but this, as it were, affects everybody here. Let me tell you an issue of this: references. Okay? People now have a right, unless they actually agree not to exercise that right, they have a right to look at any reference about them, anything that is written down. You know, it's a right under British law. Now, obviously, I write lots of references. What does that mean? The references you write, and obviously they can then make legal complaint about them. The references you write are totally anodyne. You know, Mr. X was a student with us from 2009 to 2012. This is the degree he got. What therefore happens these days is everybody does it by telephone. They ring you up and they say, off the record, we want to ask you. You know, you do take some trouble to find out they are the person they say they are, but of course what one is talking about is an absolute necessity for both parts, because the absolute right to information about somebody clashes with the difficulty of trying to establish what they're like. And you know, these are not interesting issues, these are not easy issues. Again, in universities, a minor one. There's been legal cases to do with the fact of whether universities are supposed to disclose to students in halls of residence that other students in those halls of residence have had a criminal record or not. In other words, do you have the right to know that the person in the room next to you had a criminal record and has served time for theft? Or does that person who has served their time for theft have a right to privacy in this matter? Now, you know, there's no clear, we can all, I dare say in this room, people have different views. The key point is to not get onto a moral high horse about one's own particular view, affirming some kind of absolute right or otherwise. Now, I'd like to try and broaden that out after that little diatribe. I'd like to try and broaden out by trying to say a few things about information and power, which after all is the theme of this seminar and indeed the whole series. What I'd suggest is as follows. In the late 20th century, we had a set of interpretive narratives we used in order to understand the past, to look at the present, and hopefully to consider the future. And those interpretive narratives certainly worked as far as most commentators, most intellectuals were concerned during the Cold War. They provided ways in which both Western liberal society and its non-Western illiberal counterpart in the communist bloc could each provide accounts that made sense in their own terms. I think it's fair to say that many of these narratives are less satisfactory in the present day. The idea of clear-cut social groups of a class type has proved less successful. The idea of the nation-state as the fundamental representative of those people's loyalties doesn't work so well. It works better in a society like Japan, which is much more homogeneous, but it works much less well in societies that are much more affected by what is now known as transnationalism. They're much less homogeneous. And in a sense, one has to think about, people having to think about interpretive strategies that might work more in the 21st century, might be more useful to us, and certainly might, at least initially, not be so clearly located either in a given national or a given political background. In other words, the idea that such and such a belief is automatically or axiomatically conservative or liberal, left-wing or right-wing, whatever, is one that one has to handle with some considerable care, because often those identifications arrive as a result of historical links as opposed to anything that's inherent to them. So if I was thinking about interpretive strategies, and interpretive issues, one of the key ones at the present moment, which is exercising people, is the nature of information in modern societies, and indeed in the past, and therefore in the future. Now, part of that is clearly that we are all affected by the present when we look at these things. Part of it is a fascination with technology and the ability of technology to offer access to information on a hitherto unprecedented scale and at a hitherto unprecedented rate. And that way may well change in the future. We may well have some form or other of implants in ourselves or our children or whatever, which actually offer information in even more instantaneous or comprehensive fashion. It's not at all impossible. But let's just stick with where we are at the present moment. Information then appears as both an advantage and a problem for societies and states. It's an advantage and a problem because we can see that as human beings have existed, they have had to cope with, they've been subject to greater degrees of data than they would have been, than they are naturally attuned to receive. And in a sense, one of the ways that they've responded to that is by developing information systems. That's what I try and look at in my book, how that's changed through time, and I try and make suggestions of how it would look in the future. If I might just, for example, use a very crude information system, because my friend over here referred to it. A map is a crude information system. As you will be aware, a map does not represent what you can see. For fairly obvious reasons. If we took a map, for example, of London, we'd get an aerial view with a panoptic vision. In other words, you'd see absolutely everything that is revealed to you theoretically. And of course, you take out 3 dimensions, you take out clouds, you take out the problems of scale. I mean, if you obviously think about it, you take, for example, a map of Japan and scaled it up, you'd realise that the line which represents a road or a river or a motorway at the scale level is maybe 30, depending on the scale of the map, maybe 5, 10, 30 miles wide. But obviously, there are all sorts of issues with maps, and that maps are abstractions of what you see, and they represent, in the kinds of projection you use, the perspective you use, the scale you use, and the depictions on them, choice of what to show. They represent attempts to take reality, to take the massive information that is available, and to shape it in a fashion that one is able to use it. Now, if you want, you could argue that this is conspiracy, and there is a literature which argues that maps represent conspiracy. You know, there's the famous argument of Brian Harley, who to wave the flag for Exeter was for a while a geographer then and went off to America, and now unfortunately is no longer, he died. But you know, Harley's account of how maps were used to appropriate, he particularly looks at the way in which they were used by Europeans to appropriate the New World and to depict it in their terms, etc., etc. And that argument about conspiracy is well rehearsed in the literature. What it tends not to do is deal with the fact that any map automatically has to involve, through the classification and categorization of information and then its depiction, issues of selection. There is no such thing as an unbiased map, but equally that doesn't mean that a map is necessarily biased, if you see what I mean. What it means is that there is an autonomous process there that will reflect, because human beings are porous and their society is porous, they will reflect the ideas that are circulating. If you wish to use the term bias to describe that, then we are all biased all the time, but it's not a very helpful way forward. And again, what it does is it removes any sense of value, and that's one of my principal bugbears. If you treat all maps as biased, then you're inherently saying that a map that's an A to Z is as much a system of appropriation and prejudice as a map that's produced by a clearly totalitarian or for a clearly totalitarian purpose. And, you know, I believe that actually we should face up to the difficulties of making judgments. We shouldn't see power as automatically corrupt. And, you know, I would actually say to you, and again, I'm quite happy to annoy people, I would actually say to you that an American government map is not the same in terms of its willingness to distort information as one produced by, say, the Chinese government. People don't like to listen to that tough. Now, next point that I'd like to say. Another aspect of confidentiality over the past, which I think is important, which people have tended to not think about, is this, that the spaces on which we have often relied for the development of human ideas are minority views. Unfortunately, the minority views often come right up against the tyranny of the majority. And the tyranny of the majority can be, in its demands for information about others and its unwillingness to respect the privacy of people, particularly difficult. Let me give you an example from this country. As you'll be aware, there has been a national hysteria for at least a decade about people molesting young children, which is obviously an awful thing. It's against the law, it is wrong, and the courts do and the police do try and stop it. What you will be aware of, though, and here we can think of the newspapers acting in a totally wrong fashion, is there was an attempt to argue that the governments were not sufficiently vigorous, that the public was entitled to more information, and that everybody should be therefore aware of the people who were on the sex offenders register and lived nearby. Well, you might think that's reasonable, you might think that's unreasonable, I don't know. In the hands of at least one newspaper, it ended up with people who were paediatricians, in other words, doctors looking after the ill health of children, being labelled as paedophiles, in other words, people with a criminal record and then being driven out of their homes by nasty mobs who'd read about this, had got access to the information they wanted, and of course the information happened to be wrong, but even if the information had been right, is that actually the way in which one wishes to run a civilised society? So the point I'm trying to make here is that repeatedly, information is a resource, but it's also a problem. It's a problem for whoever has it. It's not a question that a unitary and universal right to it can be postulated other than as a rhetorical device. And I think I'd like to say that that is true on the whole of most of what one thinks of the absolute rights that are affirmed. There are clearly ones that we would all agree we would like to see in a civilised society, but one has to be very, very, very cautious. I've written a number of books on newspaper history, and if you look at the debate over the freedom of the press in the 1690s, if the Licensing Act lapsed in 1695, which is what creates the freedom of the press. First of all, the freedom was always conditional because post-publication censorship remained, as it remains to this day. In other words, if you say something that is defamatory, in those days, if it was blasphemous, we still actually have blasphemy conventions in Britain, if you said something that was seditious, that could still get you into trouble. So all that you're really talking about with the freedom of the press is a move from pre-publication censorship to post-publication censorship. We're still in an age of post-publication censorship now. You might want to call that freedom of the press, I don't know. But it's not the same thing as absolute freedom. Be very careful in thinking your way through this. And in the 1690s, they went into this in some detail. It's the first English daily newspaper, the Daily Courant, comes out in 1701. You have a great growth in the press immediately afterwards. But there's also a lot of discussion about what is and isn't appropriate information to reveal in the public sphere. And of course, they come out with, you won't be surprised to hear, different views to the ones we have today. So in other words, by modern standards, they're much more restrained in what they will say about people's private life, let alone anything to do with sexuality. And they would have regarded our, the nature of the British press at the present moment. I can't speak about its Japanese counterpart in this respect. I can certainly tell you the American press could be just as lurid. They would regard this as not just lurid, but actually infringing all sense of propriety, all sense of dignity, and crucially, a freedom to have a degree of privacy. Now, we have to be very cautious of assuming that our values are necessarily better than those of the journalists writing in the 1700s or 17 teens. Similarly, on matters to do with what they called seditious libel. Their notions of seditious libel were tried in the courts, they were debated in Parliament, they were debated in the press, and you won't be surprised to hear that people had different views, that it was a complex process. They ended up allowing a considerably greater licence of reporting than they had done at the beginning of the century, or beginning of the 18th century. But at every stage they were aware of the concept of seditious libel. But
before we start to think that our society is automatically a freer society than the 18th century Britain, look at it the other way around. Britain, both in World War I and in World War II, fought a major struggle without a general election. You know, it was regarded as unacceptable to fight a general election. People's rights under the Constitution were suppressed in that respect. The Defence of the Realm Act 1914 took away most civil liberties for the extension of the war. Fair enough, that was the view taken at the time, absolutely reasonable. Of course, the view was completely different during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars, when Britain in many senses was much more threatened by internal sedition and by the potential of an invasion fleet on the other side of the Channel, because the government went on holding general elections, didn't always do well on them. At least 3 governments fell during the French Revolution and Napoleonic periods. It went on with a free press, a much freer press than during the World Wars. And again, we have to be cautious about assuming that one was necessarily better than the other. Governments respond to circumstances. It's up to politicians of both sides, it's up to the public, it's up to the electorate, it's up to the press as well to debate those. But I think it really helps if one, 5 minutes I've got, I think it really helps if we can debate those without getting, as it were, so concerned to demonise those of different views. Because to me, the real issue here is that government is actually extraordinarily hard in the modern world, extraordinarily difficult. We are, as a species, embarking on an unprecedented experiment, which is vast increase in population. It's been going on now, it's rising at a very rapid rate. The current UN figures suggest 9.5 billion by mid-century, about 10.65 by the end of the century. Who knows whether that's right or not? Nobody does, it's just an extrapolation of growth rates. But it certainly is an unprecedented experiment. We live in societies where people are much freer to express views, where pre-existing systems of deference, hierarchy, organisation have all broken down. We see these enormous mega-cities of populations of over 25 million, places like Karachi, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Kinshasa, which are under little, if any, real control from anybody. And in these contexts, we have to be aware that governance, civil society as a whole, whether you wish to think of it as mediated by a formal state structure or not, is under enormous pressure. And when one thinks in those terms, I think it is the actual weakness, the fallibility of government that emerges to me most strongly. If you believe, like I do, that you have to do something about environmental issues rather than assuming that free market capitalism is going to sort them all out, then you do require a state which is going to allocate resources and say to people, no, it's not a good idea for you to do this, that or the other, or we are going to try and use the fiscal rules to encourage some forms of behaviour and to discourage others. If one lives in a state like that, you have to accept that you do not have a full right to express endless dissent. In the end, something has to happen. People do have to move forward. Unfortunate or unpleasant or difficult decisions have to be made. And I am rather troubled and rather worried that because intellectuals as a whole, for perfectly good reasons in terms of their cultural set, tend to be critics, perfectly reasonable, because intellectuals as a whole tend to like to see themselves as dissidents. Now, I tell you this, it's rather funny if you look at their paying demands, but they don't always wish to welcome complete poverty. They're quite happy to be aspirant members of the middle class. If you want to see the ability of government to often take difficult decisions, sometimes decisions that I don't personally like, or that I think are too powerful, then in a sense we are going to have to see the ability of government to debate things in a degree of confidentiality. We are going to see that at the international level, and we have to see that as a degree at the domestic level. And I'll come back to the very last point. If you look at British government records, the vast majority relate to individual issues of confidentiality. Your medical records, your tax records. If you genuinely believe in freedom, then why on earth should those be private? If, as I assume most of you do, that you think that actually an individual has a right to freedom, why should actually government not have a right to debate policy, to consider matters, to actually exercise in a sphere in which it has that, or has cognate or limited, if you like, freedoms of its own, then is accountable. But obviously the accountability in a democratic society is you can always kick it out. But ultimately, you have to accept that if you take away the freedom to discuss things in a confidential fashion, those will go on taking place. There'll just be people on the telephone, there'll be people standing around and talking to each other, and that in a way is less helpful than allowing people to frame their ideas, to write their memoranda, to actually think through problems in as hopefully as lucid and intellectual a fashion as possible.